The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched the black Mercedes pull through the wrought iron gates of my estate. Even from the third-floor window of my study, I could see the familiar silhouettes. My brother Marcus behind the wheel, my sister Elena in the passenger seat, and hunched in the back, the woman who had orchestrated my exile 12 years ago, my stepmother, Victoria. My name is David Chen Morrison, and I built this empire from nothing. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. But they didn't know that yet. 12 years ago, I was 22 and naive, fresh out of college with a business degree and dreams bigger than my father's pharmaceutical company could contain. Dad had just married Victoria, a calculating woman 15 years his junior who saw me as a threat to her children's inheritance. Marcus and Elena were her biological children from her first marriage, and she'd made it clear from day one that there wasn't room for all of us in the family fortune. The setup was masterful, I'll give her that. A missing $50,000 from the company accounts, security footage that had been cleverly edited, and a planted USB drive in my apartment containing what appeared to be my detailed plans to embezzle funds and start a competing business. When Dad confronted me that cold November evening, his eyes held a disappointment so profound it physically hurt. "I trusted you, David," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I was going to make you CFO next year." I'd tried to explain, to protest my innocence, but Victoria had been thorough. She'd created a paper trail that would have impressed federal investigators. Bank statements showing mysterious deposits, forged emails, even fake meetings with competitors. My own father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with calculus homework, looked at me like I was a stranger. "You're no longer welcome in this house or this company," he'd declared, "and if you ever try to contact any member of this family again, I'll have you arrested for harassment." Marcus and Elena had stood behind Victoria, their faces masks of manufactured disappointment. Marcus, who I'd helped through his drug addiction in college. Elena, whose wedding I'd helped plan and pay for when she was broke. They said nothing in my defense. The will was changed within a week. I was erased from the family as if I'd never existed. For the first 2 years, I lived in a studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant, working 3 jobs and eating ramen noodles for dinner. But anger, I learned, could be an incredible motivator. I started with a small tech consulting business, working 18-hour days and reinvesting every penny. Then I moved into real estate development, then renewable energy, then pharmaceutical research, always staying one step ahead of market trends. By year 5, I had my first million. By year 8, I'd hit 10 million. By year 10, I was worth more than my father's entire company. And now, watching that Mercedes crawl up my circular driveway, I knew exactly why they'd come. Dad had died 6 months ago. Heart attack at 68. I'd read about it in the financial news, not because anyone had bothered to tell me, but because Morrison Pharmaceuticals' stock had tanked afterward. Victoria had been trying to run the company, but she had the business acumen of a turnip. Marcus was too busy with his gambling addiction. Apparently, some habits never change, and Elena had married a yoga instructor and moved to Costa Rica. The company was hemorrhaging money. They needed a buyer. They needed me. I watched them climb out of the car, their faces slack with awe as they took in the mansion. 30,000 square feet of contemporary architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean, imported Italian marble, and enough smart home technology to run a small country. The koi pond alone had cost more than most people's houses. My assistant, Jennifer, appeared at my study door. "Mr. Morrison, your guests have arrived. Shall I show them to the main salon?" I'd been using my mother's maiden name professionally for years. Morrison Pharmaceuticals had no idea that David Chen, CEO of Chen Industries, was the same David Morrison they'd cast out over a decade ago. "Give me 5 minutes, then show them in," I said, straightening my Tom Ford suit jacket. "And Jennifer?" "Record everything." The main salon was designed to intimidate. 30-foot ceilings, a chandelier that cost more than a Tesla, and walls lined with awards and photos of me with world leaders and celebrities. I'd positioned myself behind the massive oak desk I'd had imported from England, the same model Churchill had used during World War II. When they walked in, their jaws literally dropped. Victoria had aged badly. The woman who'd once carried herself like a queen now looked haggard, her blonde hair showing gray roots, and her designer clothes hanging loose on a frame that spoke of stress and poor sleep. Marcus had the bloated look of a functioning alcoholic, his once handsome face puffy and red. Elena looked better, but there was a desperate quality to her smile that suggested all was not well in paradise. They didn't recognize me at first. 12 years, 50 pounds of muscle, custom suits, and laser eye surgery had transformed the gangly college graduate they remembered. It wasn't until I spoke that understanding dawned. "Please, have a seat," I said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in front of my desk. "I understand you're interested in selling Morrison Pharmaceuticals." Victoria's face went white. Marcus actually stumbled backward. Elena's hand flew to her throat. "David?" she whispered. I smiled, the same smile I'd perfected in boardrooms from New York to Shanghai. "Hello, family. It's been a while." The silence stretched for 30 seconds before Victoria found her voice. We didn't know." "That the tech mogul you've been begging to buy your failing company is the son you framed and disowned?" "Yes. I imagine that comes as something of a shock." I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. "I've been watching Morrison Pharmaceuticals for months. Very impressive how quickly you've managed to destroy 60 years of my father's work." Marcus stepped forward, his hands shaking. "David, look, we need to talk." "Mr. Chen," I corrected. "And we are talking. You came here to pitch your company to a potential buyer. So pitch." For the next hour, I watched them squirm as they tried to present their failing business in the best possible light. Victoria stumbled through financial projections that were more fiction than fact. Marcus attempted to explain away the 3 major FDA violations that had occurred under their watch. Elena, ever the optimist, spoke breathlessly about untapped potential and synergistic opportunities. I listened without expression, occasionally making notes on my tablet, letting them hang themselves with their own desperation. Finally, I set down my stylus and looked at them. "Your company is worthless," I said simply. "Your research pipeline is empty, your manufacturing facilities are outdated, your regulatory compliance is a joke, and your debt-to-equity ratio would make a bankruptcy lawyer weep with joy. The only assets of any value are your patents, and half of those expire within 5 years." Victoria's face crumpled. "Please, David. We know we made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I stood up, my voice finally carrying the edge of anger I'd kept carefully controlled. "Framing your stepson for embezzlement isn't a mistake. It's a felony. Destroying a young man's relationship with his dying father isn't a mistake. It's evil." Elena started crying. "We were scared," she sobbed. "Mom said you were going to take everything, that there wouldn't be anything left for us. So you decided to take everything from me instead." I walked around the desk, towering over them in their chairs. "Do you know what the past 12 years have been like? Do you know what it feels like to have your own father look at you with disgust? To lose everyone you love in a single day?" Marcus finally found some backbone. "We'll go to the police," he said. "We'll tell them what really happened. Mom will confess." I laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "Will she?" "Victoria, are you prepared to admit to securities fraud, conspiracy, and perjury? Because that's what you'd be confessing to. We're talking about federal prison time. Victoria was shaking now. What do you want from us? I returned to my desk and pulled out 3 documents I'd had my lawyers prepare weeks ago. I'm going to buy Morrison Pharmaceuticals, I said, for $1. They stared at me in shock. You have 2 choices, I continued. You can accept my generous offer, or you can watch as I short your stock, trigger your debt covenants, and force you into bankruptcy. Either way, I'm getting the company. The difference is whether you walk away with dignity or in handcuffs. This is insane, Marcus protested. You can't do this. Can't I? I touched my tablet screen, and the massive wall monitor came to life, displaying a presentation I'd prepared. Slide 1. Morrison Pharmaceuticals stock price over the past 6 months, down 67%. Slide 2. Your upcoming debt payments. $42 million due in the next 90 days. Slide 3. Your current liquid assets. $4.7 million. Their faces grew paler with each revelation. Slide 4, I continued, my analysis of your bankruptcy timeline. Without immediate capital injection, you have 6 weeks before your creditors force you into Chapter 11. I clicked to the next slide. Slide 5, the FBI investigation into the Morrison Pharmaceuticals embezzlement that occurred 12 years ago. Apparently, someone tipped them off about some irregularities in the original investigation. Victoria gasped. You didn't. I did. I closed the presentation and looked at each of them in turn. The beautiful thing about being wealthy is that you can afford very good private investigators. It's amazing what they can uncover when they're properly motivated. I'd spent 2 years and $500,000 having every aspect of my frame-up professionally investigated. The real bank records showing Victoria's offshore accounts. The testimony of the security company employee she'd bribed to doctor the footage. The graphic designer who'd created the fake documents. Everything was documented, notarized, and currently sitting in an FBI field office in downtown Los Angeles. Here's what's going to happen, I said, picking up the contracts. You're going to sign these documents selling Morrison Pharmaceuticals to Chen Industries for $1. In exchange, I'll provide a capital injection of $50 million to cover your debts and keep the company operational during the transition. Elena looked confused. But then we lose everything anyway. I smiled. Not everything. I'm also prepared to offer each of you employment contracts. Victoria, you can stay on as a consultant at $50,000 per year. Marcus, I have an entry-level position in quality control that pays $35,000. Elena, there's an opening in customer service for $28,000. The insult was deliberate and brutal. These were salaries for people just starting their careers, not for people who'd been running a major pharmaceutical company. You're humiliating us, Marcus said. Yes, I agreed. I am. For 12 years, I've watched from the shadows as you destroyed everything my father built while living in luxury, purchased with money that should have been mine. Now you get to experience what it's like to start over with nothing. Victoria stood up shakily. And if we don't sign? I shrugged. Then you go to prison for fraud, the company goes bankrupt, and you lose everything anyway. But hey, at least you'll have your pride to keep you warm in your federal holding cell. The next 10 minutes were the most satisfying of my adult life. One by one, they signed the documents, their hands shaking, tears streaming down their faces. Victoria tried to maintain some dignity, but Marcus openly wept, and Elena looked like she might vomit. When it was done, I pressed the intercom button. Jennifer, please prepare severance packages for our guests. Victoria Morrison, Marcus Morrison, and Elena Morrison Rivera are no longer employed by Morrison Pharmaceuticals, effective immediately. But you said, Elena started. I offered you employment contracts, I corrected. I never said you had to accept them. Frankly, I don't think any of you are qualified for the positions anyway. I walked to the window, looking out at the ocean. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings from the Morrison Pharmaceuticals offices. Security will escort you. After that, you're trespassing. Behind me, I could hear Victoria's composure finally cracking. You're destroying us, she whispered. I turned around, and for the first time in 12 years, I let them see the depth of my anger. You destroyed me first. You took everything from a 22-year-old kid who'd never hurt any of you. You stole my father from me in his final years. You made me watch his funeral from across the street because I was afraid you'd have me arrested if I tried to pay my respects. My voice grew quiet, deadly. I spent 12 years building an empire, and now I'm going to use it to give you exactly what you gave me. Nothing. They left without another word, broken and defeated. Through the window, I watched their Mercedes disappear through my gates, carrying the 3 people who'd once held the power to destroy my life. But I wasn't done. Over the next 6 months, I systematically dismantled their lives with the same methodical precision they'd once used on me. I bought Marcus's mortgage and foreclosed on his house. I purchased Elena's husband's yoga studio and evicted them, forcing their move back to California. I bought Victoria's country club and had her membership revoked. Every legal move, every business decision, every financial maneuver was calculated to remind them that their comfort, their security, their very survival was now at my discretion. Morrison Pharmaceuticals, meanwhile, flourished under my leadership. I renamed it Chen Pharmaceuticals, invested heavily in new research, and within a year had developed 3 breakthrough drugs that revolutionized treatment for Alzheimer's disease, the same disease that had killed my grandmother while I was in exile, unable to afford the experimental treatments that might have saved her. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company they'd tried to steal from me had become the instrument of both their destruction and my ultimate redemption. But revenge, I discovered, was a dish that left a strange aftertaste. It was Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after I'd bought the company, when Jennifer knocked on my study door. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your sister." Elena stood in my foyer, looking small and lost in her second-hand coat. She'd aged years in the past 12 months, her face thin and drawn, her once bright eyes dull with exhaustion. "I'm not here to ask for money," she said before I could speak. I wanted you to know that Mom's in the hospital. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say she has maybe 2 weeks." I felt nothing. Or maybe everything. It was hard to tell. "She's been asking for you," Elena continued. "She wants to apologize, really apologize, not the fake stuff from before. She knows what she did was wrong." I stared at this broken woman who'd once been my little sister, who I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework, and walked down the aisle at her wedding. "Why should I care?" Elena flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Because despite everything, we're family. Because Dad loved you and he'd want you to forgive us. Because carrying all this anger is eating you alive, just like it's eating her." She was right, and I hated her for it. "Please, David, don't let her die alone with this guilt. Don't let yourself live with the regret of not at least listening to what she has to say." That night, I stood outside Victoria's hospital room for 20 minutes before finally pushing open the door. The woman lying in the bed was a shadow of the elegant manipulator who'd orchestrated my downfall. Cancer had reduced her to skin and bones, her once perfect hair gone, her face gray and sunken. She opened her eyes when I entered, and for a moment, I saw genuine surprise and relief. "David." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You came." I pulled a chair next to her bed and sat down. "Elena said you wanted to apologize." Tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I destroyed your life because I was scared. Scared that your father loved you more than my children. Scared that you'd get everything and they'd get nothing. I was jealous of a 22-year-old kid, and I let that jealousy turn me into a monster. She struggled to sit up, and despite everything, I found myself helping her adjust her pillows. I convinced myself that I was protecting my children, but all I did was teach them that family doesn't matter, that love can be bought and sold, that lies are acceptable if they serve your purposes. She looked at me with eyes that held 12 years of regret. Marcus has been in rehab 3 times since you bought the company. Elena's marriage fell apart because she couldn't live with the guilt. I turned my children into people I don't recognize. I sat there, watching this dying woman pour out her confession, and felt the rage that had sustained me for 12 years begin to crack. "Your father never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Even after everything. He kept your picture in his wallet. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at it, and I knew he was wondering if he'd made a mistake." Toward the end, he was planning to hire investigators to look into what really happened. I think deep down, he always knew. The crack in my anger widened into a chasm. "I can't undo what I did to you," Victoria continued, "but I can tell you that watching what you've accomplished, seeing the man you've become despite everything we put you through, I'm proud of you, David. Your father would be proud too." She died 3 days later with Elena holding one hand and me holding the other. The funeral was small, just Elena, Marcus, me, and a handful of Victoria's friends. As we stood at the graveside, Marcus turned to me with tears in his eyes. "I know you have no reason to forgive us," he said. "But Elena and we want to try to be the family we should have been 12 years ago. Not because we want anything from you, but because we miss our brother." I looked at these 2 broken people who'd once been my siblings, and I realized something. My revenge was complete, but it hadn't brought me the satisfaction I'd expected. I'd won, but I was still alone in my mansion, still carrying the anger, still defined by what had been done to me rather than who I chose to be. That evening, I called my lawyers and had them draw up new contracts. Marcus and Elena would each receive a trust fund, not enough to return them to their old lifestyle, but sufficient to rebuild their lives with dignity. In return, they would work for the reformed Morrison Foundation, a charitable organization I was establishing to provide education and opportunities for young people who'd been cast out by their families. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. A year later, as I stood in the same study where I'd orchestrated their downfall, I watched Marcus teaching my gardener's son to throw a football, while Elena helped set up a community garden for underprivileged kids. They were different people now, humbled, but also more real, more human than they'd been in the old days. My revenge had been perfect and complete. I'd taken everything from them just as they'd taken everything from me. But in the end, what saved us all wasn't the vengeance, but the choice to move beyond it. The mansion felt different now, less like a fortress and more like a home. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons when Marcus brought his kids over to swim in the pool and Elena filled the kitchen with the smell of her attempts at baking, I could almost hear my father's voice carried on the ocean breeze, telling me he was proud of the man I'd become. Not because of my wealth or my success, but because I'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies, but transforming them back into family. Even if it takes 12 years and a mansion to do it.